Salut à Team JVM, ici Tamalou, très ravi de vous retrouver aujourd'hui pour une interview exclusive autour du prochain titre d'Obsidian, c'est Avowed, et j'ai la grande chance d'être avec Carrie Patel qui est Game Director et Berto Ritger qui est Region Director. I have some questions about Avowed, the first one being about the story. It takes place in the Pillars of Eternity universe. Why did you choose that universe? Did you have something to add to this universe?
Yeah, so the world of Aora that we created for Pillars of Eternity, it has a ton of locations, a ton of very rich lore, and just a lot that we developed for Pillars of Eternity and Deadfire. And one of the most exciting settings that we hadn't explored in any of our previous games or expansions is the Living Lands. And for those of us who are on Avowed as developers of Pillars and Deadfire, I think it's one that we were very interested in returning to and telling some stories in. So, for us, the world and lore of Pillars is big, it's expansive, it's really rich, and it's got a lot of nuance that allows us to tell the kinds of stories with moral complexity that we as developers love. And so it was just a wonderful opportunity to dig into something that we already had a lot of love for and a lot of experience with.
The only thing I'd add is we wanted to bring this world that we love so much to a much broader audience for people that love to play first and third person RPGs. So that's it's a lot more accessible to that crowd of people.
You are used to have written some books, to have been narrative designer. I know you have been game director on the previous DLC from the Outer World. How did this approach, being a narrative designer in the past, has shaped you as a game director, has shaped the whole game, I would say?
So, as a former narrative designer and a writer, I think a lot about stories, but, I think for a game like ours, it's important to think about stories in terms of the player experience. The player's story isn't limited to the plot that we develop or the other characters we introduce them to. Like, when players tell stories about their experiences in games, it's, I did this, I found this, I saw this, and it made me feel this way. And so we're always thinking about, what's that player-shaped hole that we're leaving in the middle of our game, and what interesting opportunities are we giving players to fill it? So, I try not to think about things too much from the perspective of a narrative designer, but more generally as a player myself, and as someone who thinks more broadly about content as the sum total of, yes, the story, but also the gameplay and the art and the level design and the pacing and all of these moments and things that Berto could probably speak to as well.
I think that's a great answer. And I think the narrative of a game like Avowed is driven by what you do in it. Like, you'll have stories that you tell people afterwards about the way you played the game, and we want to support that. Like, it's not just about the narrative of a particular quest, but it's the way you decided to play that quest. And so we want to support that both from a gameplay perspective and what the kind of abilities you can use to traverse the environment, or what kind of skills you put points into to have checks and conversations, but also the choices you make and the way you steer the people and the settlements of the Living Lands, and how that comes together in your particular playthrough.
There is a lot of freedom in the choices about the characters. It must have been a really good challenge for you, I think.
Yes, it's, you always want these choices to be interesting in and of themselves, but also to lead to something larger for the player. And so, we definitely had a lot of fun building out those choice moments and also their consequences. But, one of the things that I'm really excited about with Avowed is obviously letting players experience things for themselves, but also, layering in a lot of small choices and a lot of bigger ones, and a lot of kind of near-term in the moment consequences, and then some that pay off much later in the game. And some consequences that you'll encounter are the result of a specific choice you've made, but some are also the sum total of several choices you've made. So, there may be certain characters who you can or can't ally with later in the game based on, a number of choices that you've made and whether or not you've proven yourself trustworthy to them. But I think it's that variety in terms of the magnitude of those consequences and the way they play out that creates this story that feels very personal to the player.
Is it why you choose to have a game that is not that long? Because you said that it was like Outer Worlds in terms of length, so maybe was it led by this kind of choice because you want to replay again? Is it why you choose that size? Because it's kind of risky for an action RPG to be that short.
I think every game has its own, its own optimum length. It's like any story. You tell the story you've come to tell, and then you respect your player's time, outside of that. I think for us, a scope like The Outer Worlds worked very well because it's allowed us to create content that is very rich. All that content is meaningful. None of it is wasting the player's time, and we make sure that all the time the player is spending in the game is going to be memorable and is something that we can really surprise them with and deliver on the promises that we're making to them.
I will say we compare to The Outer Worlds, but the density of content is quite considerable in Avowed, and there's also a lot more verticality and a parkour system that allows you to climb on different objects, basically mantle over ledges and things like that. And you can jump gaps and charge across distances, and so there's a lot of things to find. It's a very dense world, and we want to respect your time. We're people with families and things to do outside of work and things like that.
Is it why you also choose not to be an open world, so that you respect the player's time and make short areas that are more written, that are more detailed?
I think for us, building a series of connected open zones, also it allowed us to tell the story of the Living Lands and to show the breadth of the Living Lands. And you've already seen in a lot of the footage we released a variety of biomes with very different looks, kind of very different ecologies, different groups of enemies that the player is going to encounter. And so, by creating these open zones that players are traveling between and kind of giving the player this spread of regions that they're visiting across a map, I believe it gives players a greater sense that they're, traversing pockets of this big, expansive world that they're really just, kind of starting to get into the corners of. And it also allows us to tell, very cohesive and tightly bound stories and create very cohesive and kind of tonally unified experiences in each of the regions that the player is experiencing.
I would say all the regions have their own kind of personality to them, but also that kind of structure allows us to have a little bit tighter control over pacing of the main story in particular. And obviously in an RPG, in an open zone RPG, you can do a lot of anything you want at any time, but we also want like that progression across the main storyline and the consequences of those events to play out at a pace that makes sense for that story, as well as all the side quests.
About that biomes you talked about, we were really impressed with my colleagues for the artistic direction about each one and the fact that it was really diverse, but it's kind of the same environment we used to see, like fire, like ice, like wood. Like, how do you manage to change, to shift so that it's not cliche, maybe, and to...
So I'm not personally an art director, but I do work a lot with the environment art team, and so huge props to the environment art team for the work they've done. We've done a lot of iteration on the style of the game as well, but from my perspective as a designer, it's always about player clarity as well as knowing what part of a level you're in at any moment so you're not getting confused. And so especially in the Dawn Treader demo, each space you go through has its own identity. And we want that so you get a sense of progression and you have a sense of where you've been, where you haven't before, and some novelty and variety as you go through. And so that's just in that one dungeon space, but there's that across the whole game, and there's such a large variety of experiences across all the regions. They all have their own visual style, but it all feels of a piece. It's part of Aora, and there's a lot of that drawn from the Pillars games.
You choose to have a game which is on first person. It's really bold for a game like this. We have seen games like Skyrim or other things. Why did you choose that one? It was because you were used to that form with Outer Worlds or with Grounded, maybe?
I think first person creates a very immersive perspective for players. It puts you in the world, in your character's shoes. It feels like you're exploring the environments yourself. I think it's very compelling for a lot of players, but of course we recognize that it's not for everybody, and so we do have a third-person mode for accessibility reasons. So, players who prefer third-person, players who maybe get motion sick with first-person can still enjoy the game.
The demo or the game has changed a lot, of course, because of the development. Did you take some consideration, some backup from the people in consideration for the development, or did you move some lines during the development because of some return you had?
So we've had a number of playtests, both from internal playtests that we've run as a studio, and also Microsoft has an excellent user research department, and they've run, like 24-person playtests for us over the course of development. And what you get is this very wonderful, unfiltered feedback about the kinds of experiences players are having, the things that are landing well, the things that they're getting confused by, and especially in an RPG, which is a very feature-rich genre, it's very easy for players to get overwhelmed by your systems, by all of the different parts of the game that you're throwing at them, by your lore terms. And so those have actually been hugely helpful in helping us hone and target and polish our work, especially, in the last year, to make sure that that experience is clean and smooth for all of our players. And
in the beginning of the game, we have kind of a linear prologue, and then it opens up right after that. And we have done a ton of playtesting, both internally, where people on the team will be our own worst critics and say like, oh, this isn't quite landing, or like the art here isn't like clarifying this for people, or it's a little confusing or whatever. And so that feedback is really helpful, but the best is honestly those playtests from people that sign NDAs and they play and they give us unfiltered feedback.
Do you have a specific example of something you changed because during that playtest you were really sure about yourself that it would work, and maybe you had to shift something?
I know when we showed some of our gameplay footage, I believe it was this past January, feels like a much longer time ago now, we showed some combat around one of our quests in Shatterscarp. And, credit to our combat team, they'd already been doing a ton of work, but one bit of feedback that came from our players was just that enemies didn't feel quite as responsive to hits as they would have liked. It was something that our combat team was already iterating on, and anytime you see footage, it's usually a few months behind the actual development, but that feedback also kind of gave them the impetus and clarity to further hone and tune some of their work. So now we have much more reactive hit reactions from our enemies. We have directional blood trails, we have other VFX and UI flourishes that just really help both the impact and intensity of the player's attacks land, and also clarity around what's happening in combat.
The example I would think of, honestly, it's a little smaller, but we have a lot of dense lore in the game. Some of it is kind of intuitive, some of it's like not that important to the story, but you can still investigate it if you'd like. But like one of the core things in Aora is Adra, and it's this green crystal rock, and it absorbs souls, and it's part of the cycle of reincarnation, and all of that's kind of like a lot of lore to digest. But you're also a player with or a character with experience in the world, so we don't want to just say like, hey, it's a green rock, like bang you over the head with it right away. So we kind of incorporated that into the writing of the narrative. But for anything that's like history of the world, or things you really want to investigate or not sure what people are referring to, you can look those up in the middle of conversation and find that a little blurb about each one. It's similar to like Pentiment or our previous titles.
I would like to talk about companions. You said there were 4 of them. Can you tell us more about them, about the different affinities? I know there won't be any romance because you said that it would change the attitude with them. Can you tell me more about the companions, please?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we have 4 companions, and they represent a spread of species in the world of Aora, and also different classes that players are going to find useful in their party. So the first one you meet is Kai. He's on Aumaua. He's our blue-green guy, and he's your party tank. So he's a great first companion to have because no matter what your play style is, he'll complement you. He'll help take the heat off of you, especially if you're either newer to the game or if you're playing a squishier style of character. He's fantastic. We've also got Marius, who is a dwarf, and our party ranger. But yeah, all of them have very different personalities. Again, can complement kind of different play styles. And yeah, excited for players to meet them.
Will you be able to interact with them in combat, or giving them orders or stuff like that?
Yeah, so our companions, each of them have kind of their own niche in combat. They have a breadth of abilities that you can spend points into as they level up. Those can be commanded via a radial that you can pull up. You can also put those into quick slots, essentially, where you can just command them very quickly without having to open the radio. And they'll do a variety of combat things, like Kai is kind of a tank, and he can draw aggression from enemies for you if you really want to be...
Previously, you talked about the fact that users can be lost in something. What did you do against personalization, about statistics or characteristics? Will it be easy to change them for people so that they can easily adapt to the situations?
In terms of customization, both visually, we have a transmog system where any item you can make look like another if you really want the aesthetics of a certain thing. And in terms of abilities, there's a cost associated, and we're still tuning things, of course, but you can respec at any point you like, and you can try things out. You can mix and match any abilities. It's a classless game. There's not any particular, you're not locked into, I'm a mage. You can do that if you really like to role play that kind of a player, but you can mix spells and sword and shield, or you can do stealthy abilities and big bombastic spells if you really want to do something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of variety, and you can mix and match, and you can adapt as you go.
What would you say for someone that sees Avowed from far, and is like, what is really Avowed? What could you say about it?
Avowed is about discovering this new world and your place in it. You're sent to the Living Lands as the envoy of the Adiran Empire, and you also have this mysterious connection to the Living Lands that you'll explore over the course of the game. You're sent to resolve the Dream Scourge, which is the spiritual plague, and you're sent to represent your empire's interests. But, once you get there, the choices of how and whether you really choose to follow those mandates are up to you. And so we've given the player a big, exciting, dangerous, and colorful world for them to explore and get to know in whatever way and whatever level of detail they want, and also a very rich, meaty, and complex role that they're going to have to make some very hard choices about. But that's what Avowed is about, and that's what a lot of Obsidian's games are about.
Will there be any personalization for your main character? I don't think I've heard about it in the last...
We'll show our character creation off in a future update, but yes, you can absolutely make choices about the appearance of your character. Yeah, there are a lot of fun choices you can make to kind of hone exactly who they are and what their vibe in the world is.
You are a godlike in this game, which means you're touched by a god, a mysterious god in this case. And so that's part of character creation as well, and there's a lot of cool, very interesting choices you can make there. So I'm excited to see what people pick.
About Pillars of Eternity, you talked about the fact that it will be in the same universe. Of course, there will be some references to the previous game. How did you manage to do that? New players can discover the game without playing Pillars of Eternity, and old ones are like thrilled because they see some references.
I mean, I think in some ways, it's the same challenge that you have anytime you're working on an IP. It's going to be new to some of your players. It's going to be new to some people. As Berto mentioned, we have tooltips that point, specific lore terms in a glossary. So, the players who aren't familiar with some of those characters and events and parts of the world can click on those items and get an explanation, and players who already don't know or don't want to get into it can just keep moving forward as if they know everything that their character knows. So yeah, I think kind of having those on-ramps, kind of writing as if you know that you've got people who are coming to the world fresh, people who are returning to it as part of it.
Thanks a lot, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.